Kurt Cobain was 8 years old when something happened. His mother said it was the beginning of his depression, but nobody took it seriously. When Kurt Cobain's mother Wendy opened the bedroom door on that cold February night in 1975, she found her 8-year-old son sitting cross-legged on the floor, talking to someone who wasn't there. The divorce papers had been signed 3 hours earlier. Little Kurt didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just sat there, whispering to his invisible friend, Boddah, telling him that everything was going to be different now. Wendy closed the door quietly and walked away, not knowing she had just witnessed the exact moment her son began his 19-year journey toward a tragic end. But here's what nobody understood at the time. Kurt wasn't just a child dealing with divorce. What happened that night in Aberdeen, Washington, would become the blueprint for every song he would write, every stage he would walk, and ultimately, every reason he would give for why he couldn't stay in this world anymore. The little boy who loved Beatles and drawing pictures was about to disappear forever, replaced by someone nobody in that house recognized. And the most haunting part? Everything Kurt became famous for. The pain in his lyrics, the rage in his performances, the disconnection from reality could be traced back to this single moment when an 8-year-old boy realized that happy families were just pretend, and that pretending was something he would never be good at. It was February 1975 in Aberdeen, Washington, a small logging town where rain fell for 8 months a year, and opportunities disappeared faster than the timber industry that once sustained it. The Cobain family lived in a modest house on East First Street. Donald Cobain worked as an automotive mechanic. Wendy stayed home with Kurt and his younger sister Kim. To anyone looking from the outside, they seemed like a typical working-class American family. They had Sunday dinners, they watched television together, they took photos where everyone smiled. But inside that house, something had been breaking for years, and on this particular February day, it finally shattered completely. Kurt Donald Cobain was born on February 20th, 1967. For the first 8 years of his life, he was, by all accounts, a happy child. He loved music obsessively. The Beatles were his everything. He would sit in front of his parents' record player for hours, listening to Hey Jude and Let It Be on repeat, singing along even though he didn't understand all the words. Kurt was always singing. Wendy Cobain recalled years later. From the moment he woke up until the moment he went to sleep, he had this high, clear voice that just filled the house. He was joyful. That's the word I would use. Joyful. Kurt loved drawing. His room was covered with sketches, monsters, superheroes, abstract designs that didn't look like anything but meant everything to him. He was creative in a way that seemed almost supernatural for someone so young. Teachers commented on it. Other parents noticed it. Kurt had something special. He was also sensitive. Painfully sensitive. If someone raised their voice, Kurt would disappear into his room for hours. If another child was mean to him at school, he would come home and refuse to talk to it. His face closed off in a way that made Wendy nervous. She recognized something in her son that she didn't have words for. A fragility. A crack that seemed like it could spread if you pressed too hard. But Kurt was happy. That's what everyone remembers. Before everything changed, Kurt was happy. The marriage between Donald and Wendy had been deteriorating for years. They fought constantly. About money. About parenting. About futures that neither of them could envision clearly anymore. They tried to hide it from Kurt and Kim, the way parents always do, believing that children don't notice the silences at dinner or the way their mother's eyes look red in the morning. But Kurt noticed everything. He always had. In the months leading up to the divorce, Kurt's behavior started changing in small ways that nobody connected to the growing tension in the house. He stopped drawing as much. He became quieter. He spent more time alone in his room, talking to Boddah, the imaginary friend he'd created when he was 5 years old. Most children abandon their imaginary friends by age 7 or 8. Kurt clung to Boddah like a lifeline. Boddah understood things that real people didn't. Boddah listened without judgment. Boddah never left. I remember Kurt talking to Boddah more and more as things got worse between Donald and me. Wendy said in an interview decades later, I thought it was just a phase. I thought he'd grow out of it. I didn't realize that Boddah was the only friend Kurt felt safe with anymore. The day the divorce was finalized, February 1975, started like any other day. Kurt went to school. He ate his lunch. He came home. But when Wendy and Donald sat him and Kim down in the living room that evening, everything stopped being normal. Donald did most of the talking. He explained that Mommy and Daddy still loved Kurt and Kim very much, but that they couldn't live together anymore. That Daddy would be moving to a different house. That things would be different, but different didn't mean bad. Kurt sat perfectly still during this entire conversation. He didn't ask questions. He didn't cry. He just stared at a spot on the wall, his face completely blank. Kim, who was younger, started crying immediately. But Kurt just sat there, absorbing information like it was being written directly onto his soul. When Donald finished explaining, he asked if Kurt understood. Kurt nodded once. Then he stood up and walked to his room without saying a word. That night, Wendy heard Kurt's voice coming from his bedroom. She walked down the hall and pressed her ear to the door. Kurt was talking to Boddah, but the conversation was different now. It isn't playful. It wasn't imaginative. It was desperate. They lied, Kurt was saying. They said families stay together. They said we would always be happy. But they lied. Boddah? Everyone lies. Wendy felt something cold settle in her chest. She almost opened the door. Almost went in to comfort her son. But something stopped her. Maybe it was embarrassment. Maybe it was her own pain. Maybe it was the understanding that there were no words that would make this better. She closed her eyes and walked away, leaving Kurt alone with the only friend who wouldn't abandon him. The change in Kurt after the divorce wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, insidious, like watching a color photograph slowly fade to black and white. The joy that had defined him started disappearing, replaced by something darker, something heavier. He stopped listening to the Beatles. When Wendy asked why, Kurt just shrugged and said, "They sing about love and happiness. That stuff isn't real." He was 8 years old. Kurt's teachers started calling home. He wasn't participating in class anymore. He sat at his desk, staring out the window, completely disconnected from everything happening around him. When they called on him, he would answer correctly. Kurt was always smart, but his voice was flat, emotionless, like he was reading from a script for a play he didn't want to be in. His drawings changed too. Instead of superheroes and monsters, Kurt started drawing broken things. Shattered windows, torn teddy bears, houses with black clouds hanging over them. When his art teacher asked what the pictures meant, Kurt said, "This is what the world looks like when you stop pretending." 8 years old, friends stopped coming over. Kurt stopped wanting to play. He would sit in his room for hours, either drawing or talking to Boddah. Wendy would whir one-sided conversations through the door, Kurt explaining to his imaginary friend why people couldn't be trusted, why happiness was temporary, why nothing lasted forever. "I didn't know what to do," Wendy said years later, tears in her eyes. "I was dealing with my own pain from the divorce. I was trying to keep food on the table and a roof over our heads. I saw that Kurt was struggling, but I thought it was normal. I thought all kids go through this when their parents separate. I didn't realize I was watching the beginning of something that would eventually kill him." The divorce had another effect on Kurt that nobody anticipated. It made him angry. Not the loud, explosive anger that gets attention. The quiet, simmering anger that burns from the inside out. Kurt started getting into fights at school. Not big fights, not the kind that got him suspended. Just small confrontations where he would push back when someone said something he didn't like. He developed a sharp tongue, a way of cutting people down with words that left them stunned. But the anger was mostly directed inward. Kurt began hitting himself when he got frustrated. He would punch his own legs, scratch his own arms. Wendy caught him once, and when she demanded to know why he was hurting himself, Kurt looked at her with eyes that seemed far too old for his face, and said, "Because I deserve it."
Why do you deserve it? Wendy asked.
Terrified. "Because I wasn't good enough to keep you and Dad together," Kurt replied. That's when Wendy first said it. The sentence that would haunt her for the rest of her life. That was the beginning of Kurt's depression. I could see it in his eyes. Something had broken in him that I didn't know how to fix. But she didn't get him help. Nobody did. This was 1975. Mental health resources for children barely existed, especially in small towns like Aberdeen. And besides, everyone thought Kurt was just going through a phase. They thought he would bounce back. They thought time would heal him. Time didn't heal him. Time gave him space to build walls that would eventually become impenetrable. As the months passed after the divorce, Kurt was shuttled between his mother's house and his father's new apartment. This arrangement, meant to give Kurt equal time with both parents, had the opposite effect. Kurt felt like he didn't belong anywhere. He had 2 rooms but no home, 2 families but no stability. Donald remarried quickly. His new wife had children from a previous marriage. Suddenly Kurt had step-siblings, a stepmother, and a whole new family dynamic he didn't ask for and didn't want. He felt like an outsider in his father's new life, like he was the reminder of a failed first attempt. At Wendy's house, money was tight. She worked long hours to support herself and the kids. Kurt spent a lot of time alone, or with Kim, or with Boddah, the imaginary friend who, according to Wendy, Kurt genuinely believed was real. Kurt would set a place for Boddah at dinner, Wendy remembered. He would save half his sandwich for Boddah at lunch. He would introduce Boddah to people, and when they looked at him confused, Kurt would get angry. He would say, "Boddah is right here. Why can't you see him?" This concerned Wendy enough that she asked Kurt's uncle for help. The uncle tried to explain to Kurt that Boddah wasn't real, that imaginary friends were just make-believe. Kurt's response was shut down completely. He stopped talking about Boddah out loud, but he didn't stop talking to Boddah. He just learned to hide it. When Kurt turned 9, Donald gave him something that would change the trajectory of his entire life: a membership to a record club. Each month, Kurt could choose albums from a catalog. For most kids, this would be a fun hobby. For Kurt, it became an obsession. He started ordering albums by Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and Kiss. The music was harder, darker, angrier than the Beatles. It matched something inside him that he didn't have words for yet. When Kurt listened to Black Sabbath, he didn't feel alone anymore. The music understood him in a way people didn't. He would sit in his room with his headphones on, playing the same songs over and over, studying them like they contained secret messages meant only for him. In many ways, they did. The music was telling Kurt that it was okay to be angry. It was okay to be sad. It was okay to feel like you didn't fit in this world. "I need something harder but melodic," Kurt told his father once, when Donald asked why he wasn't listening to the Beatles anymore. "I need music that doesn't lie about how things are." Donald didn't understand what his 9-year-old son meant, but Kurt knew exactly what he was saying. The Beatles sang about love and happiness. Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath sang about darkness and pain. Kurt didn't trust happiness anymore, but pain was honest. By the time Kurt was 12, his relationship with both parents had deteriorated significantly. He was angry all the time now. Not just sad, angry. He snapped at Wendy. He argued with Donald. He hit back against every rule, every expectation, every attempt to control him. Wendy, exhausted and overwhelmed, made a decision that would traumatize Kurt for the rest of his life. She kicked him out of the house. The reason: Kurt hadn't earned enough school credits to trudge to the next grade. He was failing classes, skipping school, refusing to engage with the educational system at all. "I thought it would motivate him," Wendy said years later, her voice thick with regret. "I thought if I showed him there were real consequences to his actions, he would straighten up. I didn't realize I was confirming every fear he had about being unwanted, about being a burden, about not being good enough." Kurt moved in with family members, sometimes with his father, sometimes with his grandparents, sometimes with uncles or aunts. He was passed around like a problem nobody wanted to solve. Each move confirmed what Kurt already believed. He didn't belong anywhere. During this period, Kurt discovered the Melvins, a local band that played around Aberdeen. They were loud, aggressive, and completely different from anything on the radio. Kurt started hanging around their rehearsals, catching them play, absorbing everything about their sound and attitude. The Melvins' drummer, Dale Crover, took an interest in Kurt. He was the first person in years who seemed to understand the angry, isolated 12-year-old. Dale started teaching Kurt guitar. Not just how to play chords, but how to channel everything he was feeling into the instrument. Music isn't about being perfect, Dale told Kurt. It's about being honest. It's about taking everything inside you and turning it into something people can hear. Kurt held on to those words like they were a life raft in an ocean he was drowning in. Learning guitar gave Kurt something the divorce had taken away: a sense of control. When he played, he didn't have to pretend to be happy. He didn't have to act like he was okay. He could be angry and sad and confused. And it would all come out through his fingers, through the strings, through the amplifier. He started writing songs. Simple at first. 3 chords, repetitive lyrics. But there was something raw in them. Something real, something that came from the part of Kurt that had been broken since he was 8 years old. His first songs were about abandonment, about families that fell apart, about promises that got broken, about children who didn't understand why love stopped being enough. He was writing his autobiography without realizing it. He was processing trauma the only way he knew how. But here's the thing nobody understood about Kurt. He didn't just want to make music. He needed to make music. It was the difference between a hobby and survival. Music was the only language that made sense to him anymore. The only way to communicate feelings that were too big, too complicated, too painful for regular words. When Kurt performed for the first time at a small venue in Aberdeen, something shifted. On stage, he wasn't the broken kid from the divorced family. He wasn't the problem child who got kicked out of his house. He was a vessel for something powerful and important. He was the voice for everyone who felt like they didn't belong. After that first show, a girl came up to him and said, "Your music made me feel less alone." Kurt, just 14 years old, understood for the first time that his pain could have purpose, that the worst thing that ever happened to him, his parents' divorce, the destruction of his childhood innocence, could be transformed into something that helped other people. It didn't heal him, but it gave him a reason to keep going. As Kurt entered his teenage years, the patterns established in childhood only intensified. He dropped out of high school. He won a scholarship to a naval academy, but refused it, choosing instead to continue his chaotic, unstable life in Aberdeen. He formed bands that fell apart. He worked odd jobs. He lived in various places, never staying long, never putting down roots. He was searching for something, or running from something. Maybe both. In 1985, when Kurt was 18, he formed a band called Fecal Matter with Dale Crover. They recorded their first demo in Dale's aunt's house. The songs were rough, unpolished, and absolutely brutal in their honesty. They were about alienation, anger, and the fundamental unfairness of existence. When Kurt played that demo for people, many didn't know what to make of it. It wasn't pop music. It wasn't even traditional rock. It was something new, something that came from a place most people didn't want to acknowledge existed. But some people understood. Some people heard those rough, angry songs and thought, finally, someone is telling the truth about how it feels to be broken. Those people would eventually be called grunge fans. And Kurt Cobain would become their unwilling prophet. But at 18, 19, 20 years old, Kurt was still just that 8-year-old boy who sat on his bedroom floor in 1975, talking to an imaginary friend because real people kept leaving. He was still carrying the weight of that night when he realized that families fall apart, and happiness is temporary, and love isn't enough. He tried to escape it. He tried drugs, which numbed the pain but created new problems. He tried relationships, which gave him moments of connection, but ultimately reinforced his belief that everyone leaves. Eventually, he tried music, which helped more than anything else but couldn't completely fill the void that had been created when he was 8 years old. And he kept talking to Boddah. Not out loud anymore, Not where people could hear, but in his journals, in his letters, in the quiet moments when he was alone. Boddah was still there, the only constant in a life defined by impermanence. Years later, when Nirvana exploded into global fame, when Nevermind sold millions of copies, when Kurt Cobain became the voice of a generation, people would analyze his lyrics, trying to understand where all that pain came from. They would speculate about his drug use, his tumultuous relationship with Courtney Love, his struggles with fame. But the truth was simpler and more heartbreaking than any of that. Everything Kurt Cobain became, everything he created, everything he destroyed, could be traced back to a February night in 1975, when an 8-year-old boy realized that the world wasn't what he thought it was, and that the person he'd been would have to die to survive what came next. His mother was right. It was the beginning of his depression, but it was more than that. It was the beginning of Kurt Cobain, as the world would know him, brilliant, tormented, and forever searching for something that had been taken from him before he was old enough to understand what he'd lost. On April 8, 1994, when Kurt Cobain's body was found in his Seattle home, there was a note beside him. It was addressed to Boddah, the injury friend from childhood, the only friend who never left, the only one who understood from the beginning that Kurt was never going to be okay. In the note, Kurt apologized to Boddah for no longer feeling the excitement, passion he once felt for music and life. He explained that he felt like a fraud, that he couldn't pretend anymore, that he was too sensitive for this world. The note was both a goodbye and a reunion. Kurt was going back to the person he'd been before the divorce, before the pain, before he learned that happiness was temporary and love could disappear. He was going back to the 8-year-old on the bedroom floor, talking to the only friend who promised to stay forever. Wendy Cobain, Kurt's mother, would spend the rest of her life replaying that February night in 1975. The night she heard Kurt talking to Boddah through the bedroom door. The night she walked away instead of going in. The night everything changed. "I didn't understand what I was hearing," she said in interviews. "I didn't realize that was the moment I lost him, not when he died, when he was 8 years old, and I left him alone with his pain because I didn't know how to fix it." But here's what Wendy Cobain and everyone else needs to understand. It's not about blame. It's about recognition. Kurt's story isn't just about one troubled artist who couldn't handle fame. It's about what happens to sensitive children when their world falls apart, and nobody notices how deeply they're breaking. It's about 8-year-olds who stop believing in happiness and spend the rest of their lives trying to find it again. It's about the invisible wounds that never heal, just get covered up with band-aids called music, drugs, relationships, fame, anything to avoid looking directly at the fracture that never properly set. Kurt Cobain's tragedy didn't begin with a shotgun in Seattle. It began with a divorce in Aberdeen, with a little boy talking to someone who wasn't there because everyone who was there kept leaving, with a mother who recognized the beginning of depression but lived in a time and place where that recognition didn't translate into intervention. Today, mental health awareness for children is better. Not perfect, but better. We understand that divorce affects kids in profound ways. We understand that sensitivity isn't weakness. We understand that when a child creates an imaginary friend and clings to them past the normal age, it might be a sign that reality has become too painful to face alone. But in 1975 in Aberdeen, Washington, nobody understood any of that. They just saw a kid going through a rough patch, a phase, something he would grow out of. Kurt never grew out of it. He just learned to live with it, until he couldn't anymore. If this story of how childhood trauma shapes adult tragedy moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the long-term effects of seemingly small moments. Childhood. Have you ever experienced a moment that changed everything about who you became? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to ring that notification bell for more deep dives into the real stories behind music's most complex figures.